From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome once again to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. Glad you could join us for another week. Today, the focus of our program is young people, because if you're 25, you'll be 124 when the Chicago Infrastructure Trust that Mayor Emanuel just pushed through the City Council expires. Now, just what that'll mean to you and the other 124-year-olds in your retirement community isn't clear. You'll still have vague memories of the $5 billion that private companies invested in the Red Line at the request of Alderman Joe Moore back in about 2015 or so. And it sure was nice for a while, all those brightly lit stations and the new rail cars, you remember it well, but the $10 fares that the consortium of Asian companies started charging, it really cut back on the ridership of the Red Line. And it doesn't seem really fair to you that after about 80 years, you're still paying that $75 a month charge for the special assessment every Chicagoan has to pay to retire the debts of the Red Line, especially since it stopped running about 2031. So you can't be blamed for not noticing when this morning the administrative governor of Chicago simply extended the deal for another 99 years because, after all, they need the money. So here to help explain the 99-year deal that went down at City Hall just a few hours ago, almost, a couple days ago, we have Hal Dardick back from the Chicago Tribune. Okay. Hal, glad to have you with us. And for the first time from the Chicago Sun-Times, Dan Mihalopoulos joining us. I'm glad to have you, Dan.
My pleasure.
Enjoyed your work over at the Tribune and Chicago News Cooperative, so
thanks.
Been around. So, okay, maybe a little bit of a dystopian view of the future, but it might not be that far off. Who knows? We've got an infrastructure trust that we don't really know too much about, except that there were only 7 votes against it in the beloved City Council.
Well, your description there might sound Orwellian, fanciful. It certainly is made up, as you admit. But we don't really know what it's going to be like precisely. We certainly don't know what projects. I mean, Joe Moore threw out there, as you said, that stuff that's not been funded that they've wanted to do for a long time, like Red Line improvements. And right now, there's only one thing on the table that's been mentioned. There's nothing official yet, really, is there?
And that's retrofitting a couple of buildings.
Retrofitting some buildings. You'll get private investors. We'll get paid back out of the savings that the city is expected to accrue from making the buildings more green, more environmentally friendly. Other than that, if he does have a list, and I assume that the 5th floor of City Hall does have a list, they haven't made it public. I assume that he considers that part of his pre-decisional. You know, they've put out there many things that could be funded under the infrastructure trust. But it's really just a list of all the things that they said that they were going to do anyway, and that they don't want to accrue more debt to do. I mean, they've listed, right, all the water infrastructure improvements.
Right, which is funded through traditional bonds, so you kind of wonder what they're talking about.
And have already been announced.
They've already been announced. They're supposed to be paid for by the increase in water rates that people already are paying in Chicago and in the suburbs that get water from Chicago. So what exactly is this going to be? Your guess, you know, however inventive it might be, could be as accurate as anybody else's.
No. Don't say that. Don't say that. I'm just being, we kid the mayor. You know, we like to be a little sarcastic sometimes. But
it was interesting during the debate because John Arena, one of the no votes on this, kept saying, well, you know, you keep talking about retrofit Chicago, that's $225 million about. And yet you're talking $1.7 billion in investment from 5 major investment firms. So why did they say we're maybe willing to put up that kind of money if they don't know what's going on?
So, I mean, how did this work? Did they just put out some request for a request for proposals, I guess, saying how much money would you be willing to give us if we wanted to do a bunch of really big projects? And like a whole bunch of guys wrote back and said, well, how about a 1.7 billion?
Yeah, I don't even think it was a traditional request for proposals. I think that it was the administration going to people that they know,
making a few phone calls.
And the top financial officials in the administration were in the private sector world doing these kinds of things previously. So I think, you know, they just kind of picked up the phone and said, hey, we're thinking about
Could we put you down for a $600 million?
Yeah,
sure.
I think they called Bill Clinton, too. I understand.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah.
It's fun. Daley used to talk about doing this sort of thing. Richard M. Daley, I
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
I should say, when we talk about former Mayor Daley's.
Right,
Now we should
right.
specify which one. But he talked near the end of his administration. I remember
The first
him going
one had
to China.
LBJ on speed dial. He could just call. Well, they didn't have speed dial, but he knew how to reach the president. So he had all the
Right,
money
they
he
put him
needed.
straight through. But Richard M. Daley went to China some point during his last year in office after he said that he was going to step down and not seek another term, and talked about seeking infrastructure investment.
Right.
You know, you were talking about in your Orwellian, 1984 or 2084
right.
description there at the beginning of the program about Asian investors. Well, this is a global marketplace for infrastructure. And when you do look at the other privatization deals, and I do think that despite what the mayor says, there are a number of similarities there, you see a lot of money coming from really all over the world. And so who's really going to own Chicago or own whatever proceeds are made from improved public assets, be they public transit, schools, or just environmentally friendly government buildings, that's all up in the air. And in many ways, there were way more details and way more specificity involved in the deals that Richard M. Daley put to the city council and that were approved, although one of the three particularly has been pilloried, the parking meter
right,
deal.
yeah.
Everybody knew what they were gaining and what they were losing at that point. I don't know that that's the case here.
What I thought was, there were a couple of things that just right out of the box at the city council meeting the other day I thought were just really fascinating. First of all, the fact that Joe Moore apparently is so willing to be embraced by the new mayor that he allowed himself to be the lead point guy and was the first speaker at the city council.
Yeah, 16 minutes of speaking.
A 16-minute oration in which he not only praised the mayor, but kind of laid out this vision for what could happen. And what was doubly interesting about it was that for the first time we saw the infrastructure trust tied to something like the CTA, because whenever anybody's asked the mayor about it, he's always said, we don't know. We've only got a couple of $1 million worth of new windows for the cultural center, maybe a new boiler for the cultural center, something like that. But it's nothing much. And then suddenly Joe Moore stands up and does this borderline eloquent speech about my ward has this decrepit rail line that people are afraid to use, and they don't know if they're going to safely get downtown without it falling to the street below, practically, just painting this horrid vision of the Red Line, and we will be able to fix it all and extend it to 130th Street if you'll just vote yes today.
And which isn't clear at all that it
Exactly.
would apply to this,
Right.
Because the mayor's talking about what he calls transformative infrastructure,
right, not
which he
repair.
says things that are going to change
Yeah.
the city, not just fix them. So, yeah, it is mysterious. Although Lois Scott, the chief financial officer, did, when she was before the Tribune editorial board, throw out one more example, although it's sort of another benign example like Retrofit Chicago. It sounds safe, doesn't it? That they could buy new CTA buses instead of fixing them, and then the money saved by not having to fix these buses all the time would then go and pay the investment firms back for that.
But that's similar to what's happening now. All of these hybrid buses that are on the street, the CTA doesn't own them. Those are all a lease-back kind of arrangement. They've been doing that for years. They were doing that 15 years ago when they tried the what do you call them? I forgot the name of them, but the special battery buses that they were trying to do, and those hydrogen buses, and those didn't work out. But they didn't own them, and I think a lot of people are trying that where you kind of lease. But I just don't understand how this is different from things that have been done before. It just doesn't make sense to me. And also, the biggest question of all is when, and I suppose we should say if, but when these things don't pay off the way they're supposed to. Isn't this kind of like the deal we got into with the Comiskey Park situation, U.S. Cellular, where the taxpayers are on the hook for it if if the financing doesn't work out? I mean, aren't we eventually going to pay for all of this either way?
Well, we're going to pay for it, although the argument by the administration is they take on a certain level of risk. For example, in the what Dan was talking about, Retrofit Chicago, if those savings are not realized, then the investors don't get paid, according to the administration. So they're trying to say we're transferring risk. But you're right. I mean, these things have gone on in other states. I think in California, near San Diego, they were building a toll road. The private investors that were building it and were going to pay it off with the tolls, the economy went bust, people weren't paying the tolls, went broke, and then the government ended up having to buy it back. They say they got it at a bargain price, but they're obviously going to have to maintain it and keep that infrastructure.
Right.
So
that's the part that I find myself just really feeling kind of cynical about, because I have to tell you, the second time on Tuesday, sitting watching the council debate, I found myself kind of being swayed a little bit. I mean, I think Mayor Emanuel is making a persuasive argument that we need to do something bold, that we can't continue with the status quo. We got to try new things, and he is passionate about this idea that he doesn't want to make the mistakes of the last administration. That guy whose name we can't remember, who used to be mayor.
He who shall not be named.
He who shall not be named, right.
Who
Who actually sold off assets. And Mayor Emanuel is saying, we will not do that. We will retain the assets. We will just have other people help us fix them. But then you get to that question, okay, all right, so they help us fix them, and then it doesn't pay off properly. What happens? They just walk away and say, oh, well, that was a bad investment?
yeah, that's a big question. Big question. The other question, I think, is what Dan says. We don't, like when Daley talked about a rapid transit line, went to Asia to sort of promote that. I think you were referring to that, to O'Hare from downtown.
High-speed rail to O'Hare.
We knew what he was talking about. In this case, they've approved something we don't know exactly. Although, and here's the question: when these things come back and they don't involve the city council, will we ever fully know what they're about? If they involve some city money, theoretically, the city council will get briefed on. But what do we know? What do they don't? If the city decides not to release documents, if we want to challenge that under the Freedom of Information Act, we have to go to the city. And they have to decide whether they're going to enforce that or not instead of the state or the court.
And that's a very important point that I think gets lost in a lot of the stories, because it gets bumped down to the 7th or 8th paragraph. But it's really important that a new entity of some kind would be created to oversee this, and it would be a sort of a quasi, or maybe not even quasi-government agency. I mean, it's just kind of like this not-for-profit board that would be deciding how the Park District, the CTA, the Board of Education, the city, all these projects are done, and it's not elected. It's not representative. Some aldermen were saying it's taxation without representation.
The IG wouldn't be able to investigate it, and of course the aldermen are always hesitant to expand the powers of the inspector general. But in this case, it wouldn't be investigating them. There will only be one alderman apparently allowed on there, and you can guess there are many that are on the same page as the mayor.
It's not going to be Alderman Wagaspak.
I don't think that he's the leading candidate. I don't think he's on the short list for that position. The other four, we could mess around just like you did at the beginning of the program and invent 4 names of people who would be very pliant and would be willing to do whatever they're told by the 5th floor, and we probably wouldn't be that far off if we were guessing at those names. I don't see, if this is such a transformative thing, and if this is going to be so hugely influential in the future life of the city for such a long period, why they wouldn't go through the legislative process. Again, it's not as if the legislative process has been much of a hurdle for this mayor or previous mayors, and yet they have short-circuited the process even more.
That is so Dan, the way he put that. It's not as though the legislative process has been much of an impediment to mayors.
As far as freedom of information, I'm not putting up the white flag yet either. I mean, they say that it doesn't apply to it, but I mean, as far as I know, it's a state law, and we'll see. Perhaps there'll be some cases where we appeal their decisions or their rejections to the
by
Attorney
forming
General,
a not-profit corporation, though, I talked to some experts. They say that doesn't apply. It's a big fault in the state of Illinois.
One of many,
Well, right.
Well, all right.
I did ask the mayor. I don't think he was pleased. I asked him if he would go to Springfield and try and change that law, because he does have a fair amount of influence. And, if
And
he's
I think he
really-
told you
and he's-
something
and he is the
like-
transparency mayor, but
Yeah.
he said he would take that under advisement.
But right now he's got a lunch plan and he's got to go. Right? Yeah. So I'll get back to you on that. Yeah. Well, this is something that we'll be talking about on the show for the next 99 years. So tune in. Why don't you tune back in about 2046, and we'll have these guys back and we'll see what's going on. Okay. We really can't resolve it, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it sure is a little bit on the doubtful side at this point. Although, as I said, you got to give the guy credit. He's at least trying to do some really big, bold things. And
There's no doubt the need is enormous. Nobody's arguing with that, and that's what he hammered away at. Again, the project in Waggispac's ward, which where they had a sinkhole because of problems in century-old underlying infrastructure. That was the same example that they used a few months ago when they raised the water rates. I thought the water rates were going to pay for that sort of project to avoid that particular sort of problem. So
I got to tell you, I'm so suspicious of that. I'm wondering if it wasn't a sewer department employee that they sent out there with a car full of that hole just because
car
they
fell
needed
in.
it.
I think the guy went to the hospital too.
Yeah, well, that was the joke
it
around
was
City
legit.
Hall that the
Right.
mayor went out there with
Jackhammered it, right?
Well, these things happen all the time. These water main breaks happen constantly. It's just since he was pushing to rehab the infrastructure and raise the water rates, we get a press release on almost any occasion of dramatic.
You can only so many times say we're doing this for the children. Once in a while, you have to say we're doing it for the people so they won't fall into sinkholes in their cars. That's also an important part. of
People
what-
of
I
all
think
ages.
you're right. The proof will be over the long run.
It will.
This thing.
It definitely will. Dan, related material, but a completely different story. You broke a story the other day, which I thought was just incredibly interesting, about this deal with the Millennium Park garages. Now, we were all around when that deal was announced, but I had absolutely no idea that when they gave away the Millennium, that other guy whose name can't be mentioned, when he gave the Millennium Park and Grant Park garages away for 99 years to the private sector, apparently there was a side deal.
Well, it wasn't really a side deal. It was a provision of the
A
concession
less
agreement.
visible part of the deal.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're all guilty. I remember when the parking meter deal went through, Alderman Mell said, I admit I'm not going to read, all 300 pages of this. Now,
They say that at the Supreme Court,
I was trying
too.
to remember where I was when they approved the 2006 deal where the city got $563 million to lease those 4 downtown garages with many thousands of spaces to a consortium led by Morgan Stanley. It's the same company that really was a driving force behind the parking meter concession agreement. And I think I was spending most of that year covering the corruption cases that were enveloping the mayor's administration and even affected people in his office. So I don't remember if I read it at that time, but more recently we did read a provision that says...
Went back and read it.
Yeah, we went back and read it, and with good reason. The company that is leasing these parking garages and is getting all the proceeds from raising the prices there has basically filed an arbitration claim against the city. This is under the deal. They also, under all these deals actually, they agree to go to arbitration. And there's basically a private arbitrator, the American Arbitration Association, that will decide whether this was fair. But they accuse the city of violating an anti-competitive provision. So there was a provision in the deal that said you can't allow any new public parking garages, not publicly owned, but open to the public parking garages within a radius of quite a large radius. I think the boundaries were Lake Michigan or Lakeshore Drive, Michigan Avenue, the river, and down to maybe, it could be down all the way to Roosevelt, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, State is one of the other boundaries. In any case, what happens is you allow a garage in this area, and they can file a claim against the city saying that they're damaged. And they say they wouldn't have paid anywhere near $563 million without this very provision, which is a very brief provision in a 300-page document. So now they say this new garage in the Aqua Building, I don't know if you've seen the Aqua Building, 82-story building that's won all these architectural awards. It's a stunning structure at
Just north of
225,
Millennium Park.
225 North Columbus.
Yeah.
That's a block away from the Millennium garages, and you or I can go over there today. We could park in there, and that is supposed to be prohibited to people either in the building or in that area around the building. I don't work or live in that area, and I can park there for $1 less than the private concession company is charging. So they want $200 million in damages. Essentially, they want almost half the money back that they paid because they say
because
that
one garage opened a block away.
Well, they say that that's hurting their business.
You know, that came up in the. I'm sorry to take us back again to the infrastructure trust, but that came up at City Council. Somebody used that as an example that we got a $200 million bill to pay here.
And I think it's a great, terrific example of what happens when you bring the private sector into the public domain to do work for the people, because their goal is the profit motive, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what our country's built on. But at the same time, the city's goals are often different.
Government goals.
And isn't having more parking something that's desirable in the city, and having good prices for people to park. But and there's a conflict there, and it happens with the parking meters. Well, they have to make a certain amount of money, and I think Dan did some work on this too about how they're suing, or the Sun-Times did some work about how they're suing the city because the people that have placards, handicapped, disabled placards, that they get free parking, so they're losing money. They want $15 million for that, but that conflicts with how the city wants to run their disabled parking program. And all these, where they want meters, and maybe they don't want meters in a certain place. They want the goal becomes profit and not the welfare of the people.
Well, and we also saw there have been some interesting stories about like the neighborhood festivals that have been kind of put on hold because they can't afford to take away the parking spaces for a day because the city's on the hook for that. It just goes on and on and on. Could we switch topics just briefly to the upcoming NATO conference that's coming to Chicago? We have, Dan, your paper today has the red zone on the front cover.
Training exercise.
Yeah, right. It looks like a large swath of the McCormick Place area is going to be essentially off limits for a couple of days. Is this a big deal, or should we be agitated about this?
I'm wondering how big a deal it's going to be. You know, on the one hand, my gut says it might be a Y2K type thing where we're worrying. On the other hand, the proof is in the history. You know, these things have been extremely disruptive to communities and have ended up being violent in some cases. These sort of events attract protesters who are very vehement, to say the least. And so right now they're trying to walk a line between First Amendment rights and prohibiting people from basically doing anything illegal, particularly vandalism. But the exercise that you're talking about will start next week, well, almost a month ahead of the summit itself, where you'll see people with, I guess, weapons, beanbag guns, I guess they're called, that are not real weapons, but you know, federal officials, law enforcement in full gear, going around an area of downtown, far beyond McCormick Place, actually, into downtown. And so their goal is to prevent any disruption in government buildings, you know, like the Dirksen building, and much less any violence, you know, from ensuing in those areas.
Yeah, it is an open question. I mean, moving G8, I think, saved us perhaps attracting the anarchists, or well, I'm not going to say they won't come, but you know, some of the more vehement protesters. At the same time, you know, it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to close. I think a lot of people are just going to be inconvenienced. It's going to close down streets. Probably could close down Lakeshore Drive at certain points in time. It might close down the Stevenson.
But only for 2 days, though, right?
Right.
I mean, I shouldn't say. I don't want to.
Well, there'll be people here before and after that, though, too. So I don't know how far their formal events, you know, will extend into those.
No, it'll give a lot of people an opportunity to take a day off and stay away, I guess.
Well, it's an interesting cap to the mayor's first year in office.
Yes, it is.
You know, and I think that's one reason he wanted this infrastructure trust approved last week, so that could be something he could say he did. In
May 16th, I believe, right?
Yes.
So that's his anniversary. And,
right, and then NATO comes.
Yeah.
A lot of people around City Hall are asking why he really wants to do this. I mean, the risk of having something highly embarrassing happening seems to outweigh whatever gains, or if there are gains to it, and he says that there are, they've had a difficult time, I think, articulating and quantifying what those gains would be for the city as a whole, and really what people are wondering, what are the gains for him, you know?
I think he's hoping in the best case scenario they get national spotlight on the city, world spotlight.
Well,
but you're right, it's a
right, but I don't see it like the Olympics where people are going to be doing features in the foreign media about some of the, I guess they could say some nice things about Chicago, but aren't they going to be here to cover the substance of what's going on?
They might catch the Al Capone tour bus.
Well, I think you know that there's always been this notion that the thing that Chicago administrators want the most is that morning shot on, you know, now I guess Good Morning America, but you know, the beautiful skyline shot, pull back to the anchor saying Chicago is a beautiful city, and today it's where, you know, that's what everybody's after, I guess. So I happened to watch Chicago Tonight the other night. Elizabeth Brackett was talking to your new boss, Jim Kirk. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, we talk about journalism and Chicago newspapers and everything all the time on the show here. I was like awash with enthusiasm. It was an amazing interview with a guy who seems to be very gung-ho on the future of the Sun-Times. You have any sense? I mean, you've worked with him in a couple of places, right? You've both been...
Yeah, we both worked with him at the Trib, and I worked with him at the Chicago News Cooperative when we were putting out a Chicago section for the New York Times for a couple of years. And he was a managing editor there. I was a reporter, as I am now. And so I had a lot of dealings with him. And he's an extremely hardworking individual who once, I probably shouldn't say this, once was found pretty late at night, almost asleep at his desk, you know, putting in so many hours. So he's got a great deal of...
good work ethic on that guy.
Yeah, he's a good work ethic, and I think from his experiences at Cranes, probably particularly, is looking at a lot of ways to bring the newspaper as we know it, and newspapers as we know them, print publications into the digital age, and probably speed up some of the reporting and kind of change the print product to be more sort of analytical and more forward-thinking rather than just reporting what happened yesterday, which
he said
in this era is old
very
news.
interesting things on this interview about sort of pushing the news day forward instead of being beholden to the press-run deadlines of the newspaper, and making, you know, obviously pushing the digital product out more. And Elizabeth asked him a question about when do you think the physical paper will stop being printed, and he kind of hesitated and said something about, well, I mean, it will be sooner, you know, a couple of years, and then he just said, sooner than you think. So that's a very interesting thing to look for. Anyway, we're out of time, as always happens. We've got so many more things to talk about, but we don't have time to do it. So I want to thank Dan. Thanks for coming into the show today, and I hope you'll come back again sometime. Dan Mihalopoulos from now the Chicago Sun-Times, and of course Hal Dardick from always the esteemed Chicago Tribune. Glad to have you both with us today. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You know you can find us here right on cable, but you can also see this show online at this address right here. You can subscribe on iTunes and listen to the audio, and you know we make personal appearances at the Jewel, whatever we can do to get you to watch. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you for watching, and we'll see you next week, whether you like it or not, right here on. Thanks for watching.